When the tech executive boarded first class on American Airlines Flight 223 from New York to Los Angeles, he had no idea his arrogance was about to meet its match in Hollywood royalty. But before we dive into this incredible story about respect and humility, comment below where you're watching from today. The first-class lounge at JFK International Airport hummed with the quiet energy of wealth and privilege. Crystal glasses clinked against silver trays, and the air carried the subtle scent of expensive cologne mixed with freshly brewed Arabica coffee. Among the well-dressed travelers sat an elderly gentleman in a comfortable cardigan and well-worn slacks, his presence somehow both understated and commanding. Kirk Douglas had seen enough of life to know that true character rarely came dressed in designer labels. At 97, he had witnessed the rise and fall of countless stars, had seen how fame could inflate egos and deflate souls. Today, he was simply a man wanting to travel in comfort, his age earning him the right to dress for it. Robert Sterling, however, held a very different view of the world. Fresh from closing a billion-dollar tech merger, his Armani suit and Patek Philippe watch weren't just clothes, they were armor, signals to the world of his self-proclaimed importance. As he strode through the lounge, his eyes swept dismissively over anyone he deemed beneath his station. Catherine Martinez, the lead flight attendant, noticed both men immediately. 20 years of experience had taught her to read people quickly, and these two were a study in contrasts. One carried himself with natural dignity, the other with practiced superiority. She had a feeling their upcoming flight might prove interesting. The boarding process began smoothly enough. Emily Watson, the junior flight attendant, guided passengers to their seats with practiced efficiency. But when Robert Sterling saw who would be sitting next to him in seat 2A, his perfectly manicured eyebrows rose in obvious disapproval. James Wilson, the retired film critic seated across the aisle, glanced up from his newspaper just in time to witness what would become one of the most talked-about encounters in first-class history. He would later tell his colleagues that he knew something was about to happen the moment he saw Sterling's face twist into that condescending smirk. "I believe there's been a mistake," Robert announced loudly, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for those accustomed to having their every whim accommodated. "This section is first class." His eyes ran deliberately over Kirk's casual attire, making his meaning clear. Kirk simply smiled, the kind of smile that had charmed audiences for over half a century but held a hint of something more, a quiet confidence born of having seen it all before. He reached for his seatbelt without responding, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Sandra Parker, the business traveler seated behind them, recognized Kirk immediately. She had grown up watching his films, and her father had often spoken about how Douglas had helped break the Hollywood blacklist by insisting on crediting Dalton Trumbo for Spartacus. "Perhaps," Robert continued, his voice dripping with faux concern, "you've wandered in from business class? Easy mistake to make." He gestured to Emily Watson as if summoning a servant. "The young lady can direct you to the correct section." Michael Collins, Robert's business associate in 1C, shifted uncomfortably. He had worked with Robert long enough to know the man's penchant for public displays of superiority, but something about this situation felt different. The elderly passenger carried himself with too much quiet dignity to be someone who had wandered into the wrong section by mistake. Margaret Thompson, who had boarded earlier and taken her seat in 3A, watched the scene unfold with growing indignation. As someone who had lived through Hollywood's golden age, she recognized not just Kirk Douglas's face, but the significance of his presence. "I assure you," Robert pressed on, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced precision, "first class has certain standards. I'm sure you understand." His smile didn't reach his eyes, which held the cold calculation of someone used to having their way through intimidation and social pressure. Kirk turned slightly in his seat, studying Robert with the kind of patience that comes from decades in an industry where ego often overshadowed talent. His response, when it came, was quiet but carried easily in the hushed cabin. "Oh, I understand plenty, son. Please, don't let me make you uncomfortable." The seeming acquiescence in Kirk's voice only encouraged Robert further. "It's not about comfort," he declared, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. "It's about maintaining appropriate distinctions. Surely you can appreciate that some spaces are reserved for those who've earned them." Captain Thomas Brooks, doing his pre-flight cabin check, paused briefly near their seats. He had flown enough celebrities to recognize Kirk Douglas instantly, but more than that, he recognized the type of situation unfolding. Sometimes the best course of action was to let certain lessons teach themselves. Catherine Martinez approached with practiced grace, ostensibly to offer pre-flight drinks. "Can I get you gentlemen anything before takeoff?" Her eyes met Kirk's with professional neutrality, though the slight crinkle at their corners suggested she was enjoying the situation more than she let on. "Champagne," Robert declared without looking at her. "The Dom Perignon if you have it, though I doubt my fee would know the difference between that and sparkling cider." He laughed shortly, clearly expecting appreciation for his wine knowledge. Kirk's response was to pull out a worn paperback, his own autobiography, The Ragman's Son, and begin reading, his posture relaxed but his presence somehow filling the space without effort. The contrast between his calm demeanor and Robert's increasing agitation was becoming more apparent by the moment. David Foster, approaching with warm towels, caught Catherine's eye with a knowing look. Both flight attendants had recognized Kirk the moment he boarded, but years of professional discretion kept them from acknowledging it openly. Besides, something told them this situation would resolve itself in due time. As the final boarding announcements echoed through the cabin, Robert made one last attempt to assert his perceived superiority. "You know," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie, "I've earned my place here through years of hard work and innovation. I wouldn't expect someone of your generation to understand the value of that." The irony of his words hung in the air like expensive cologne, cloying and obvious to everyone except the man who had spoken them. Kirk simply turned another page in his book, his silence more powerful than any retort could have been. But those who looked closely might have noticed the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, the kind of expression that suggested he had faced similar situations before and found them more amusing than offensive. After all, when you've played Spartacus and Van Gogh, when you've helped break the Hollywood blacklist and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, you learn that true character reveals itself in how you handle those who underestimate you. The stage was set, the players were in place, and as the massive engines roared to life, nobody in first class was paying attention to the safety demonstration. They were all too busy watching what was shaping up to be a masterclass in humility, taught by a man who had helped shape the very industry that defined American culture, to a man who had no idea he was about to become the student. As Flight 223 reached its cruising altitude, the atmosphere in first class had taken on the tense anticipation of a theater just before the curtain rises. Robert Sterling, emboldened by both champagne and an audience, had decided to transform his seat into a pulpit from which to preach his philosophy of social hierarchy. "You see," he announced to no one in particular, though his words were clearly meant for his elderly seatmate, "first class isn't just about the wider seats or better champagne. It's about being among equals." He adjusted his Patek Philippe watch with deliberate precision, ensuring the light caught its face. "It's about maintaining certain standards." Kirk Douglas turned another page in his autobiography, his composed demeanor a stark contrast to Robert's increasing agitation. The actor's silence seemed to occupy more space than Robert's words, drawing the attention of everyone in the cabin without demanding it. Catherine Martinez approached their seats with the grace of someone who had navigated similar situations countless times before. "Would either of you care to see our lunch menu?" she asked, her professional tone masking her growing admiration for Kirk's restraint. "Ah, yes," Robert practically purred, accepting the leather-bound menu with the air of a connoisseur. "Though perhaps you should bring the seniors menu for my companion here. Wouldn't want to overwhelm him with too many choices." He chuckled at his own wit, looking around for appreciation that didn't come. James Wilson, watching from across the aisle, found himself marveling at Kirk's composure. Lesser men would have snapped by now, would have pulled the celebrity card or demanded respect. Instead, Kirk simply smiled at Catherine and requested the salmon, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone that had commanded attention in countless films. Margaret Thompson had long since abandoned any pretense of reading her magazine. This was the kind of human drama that reminded her of the golden age of Hollywood, a clash between genuine character and superficial status. "I suppose," Robert continued, swirling his second glass of champagne, You're wondering how someone like me affords to travel this way regularly. He gestured to his Armani suit and handmade Italian shoes. It comes from understanding value, from knowing how to move in certain circles. Sandra Parker, herself a successful businesswoman, couldn't help but cringe at Robert's display. She had encountered plenty of self-made individuals in her career, but the truly successful ones rarely felt the need to broadcast their achievements quite so loudly. Emily Watson arrived with warm towels, offering them first to Kirk with a slight smile that didn't go unnoticed by Robert. His face darkened momentarily before he plastered on an even more condescending smile. "Tell me," he said, leaning toward Kirk, "what exactly did you do before retirement? Security guard? Janitor perhaps?" Kirk finally closed his book, marking his place with deliberate care. His response, when it came, carried the weight of decades in entertainment. "I worked in pictures," he said simply, his voice still carrying that powerful resonance that had made him a legend. "Pictures?" Robert's eyebrows shot up with mock interest. "Oh, how charming. Wedding photographer? School portraits?" His laugh was sharp and meant to cut. "Though I suppose everyone needs their picture taken sometimes." Michael Collins seemed to sink lower in his seat, as if trying to physically distance himself from the increasingly uncomfortable display. He had seen that look of quiet amusement on Kirk's face before, on classic movie posters and in film history books. David Foster appeared with their appetizers, his service professional but his eyes sparkling with anticipation. He had been quietly updating the other flight attendants about the situation during his breaks, and word had spread throughout the crew that something extraordinary was unfolding in first class. "You know," Robert proclaimed, cutting into his foie gras with surgical precision, "I recently invested in some tech startups that are revolutionizing digital photography. But I suppose that's a bit advanced for someone of your era." He looked pointedly at Kirk's cardigan. "You probably still think a smartphone is a clever telephone." Kirk took a sip of water, his movements unhurried. "Technology changes," he said, his voice carrying years of wisdom, "but people remain the same. Success still requires the same fundamental qualities it always has." Robert launched into a detailed monologue about his latest tech ventures, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. He name-dropped Silicon Valley firms and astronomical valuations, each word carefully chosen to establish his superiority. Captain Thomas Brooks chose that moment to walk through the cabin on one of his regular checks. He paused briefly near their seats, exchanging a knowing look with Catherine Martinez. Both had seen enough of life to recognize when karma was about to teach a masterclass. "But enough about me," Robert said, though his tone suggested he could hardly imagine a more fascinating subject. "Tell me more about your picture-taking days. Did you ever photograph anyone important? Celebrities, perhaps?" His smile was shark-like. "I've met quite a few myself at various tech conferences." Margaret Thompson had to bite her lip to keep from laughing out loud. She had watched Kirk Douglas films since she was a young girl and knew his reputation for handling difficult situations with grace. This was proving to be no exception. "I've met a few interesting people over the years," Kirk replied, his voice carrying that characteristic mix of strength and humility that had endeared him to audiences for decades. "You'd be surprised how much you can learn from simply listening to others." "Oh, I'm sure you have," Robert said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The catering staff at events can meet all sorts of famous people. But let me give you some advice. Someone in your position should learn to network with the right people. People like me who could keep you relevant in the digital age." James Wilson watched as Kirk's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the only visible sign that he was thoroughly enjoying the irony of the situation. The actor's restraint was becoming something of a performance in itself, though his audience had no idea they were watching a master at work. The meal service continued, with Robert becoming increasingly expansive in his self-promotion. He detailed his rise through the tech industry, his multiple homes, his connections to Silicon Valley elite. Each story was clearly designed to emphasize the vast gulf he perceived between himself and his elderly seatmate. Catherine Martinez returned to check on them, her professional mask slightly cracking as she heard Robert explaining to Kirk the difference between economy and first class as if teaching arithmetic to a child. "You see," he was saying, some people are simply meant for greater things. It's about understanding your place in the world. The other first-class passengers had given up any pretense of not listening. Sandra Parker had pushed aside her laptop entirely, while Michael Collins seemed to be trying to disappear into his seat. They, like everyone else in the cabin, could sense that this situation was building toward something momentous. As the flight progressed, Robert's behavior became increasingly theatrical. He made a show of every interaction with the crew, emphasized every luxury the first-class cabin offered, and continued to pepper Kirk with condescending advice about knowing one's place in the world. Kirk, for his part, maintained his calm demeanor, responding to Robert's provocations with small smiles and occasional nods. His responses, when they came, were measured and thoughtful, showing none of the defensiveness or irritation that Robert seemed determined to provoke. Emily Watson approached with fresh drinks, just in time to hear Robert launching into another self-aggrandizing story. You know, he was saying, I just closed a deal that would probably equal your lifetime earnings. Maybe more. He paused, clearly expecting some sign of awe or envy. Instead, Kirk simply smiled that same warm, knowing smile that had graced countless movie screens. Money is a poor measure of a man's worth, he said, his voice carrying no trace of bitterness or resentment. I've known both poverty and success, and neither one defines who you are. The sincerity in Kirk's response seemed to throw Robert slightly off balance. He had clearly expected either intimidation or antagonism, and this graceful acceptance of his boasting left him momentarily at a loss. But only momentarily. Well, Robert recovered, straightening his tie, that's the difference between people like me and, well, people like you. We understand the value of success, of presentation, of maintaining certain standards. He gestured dismissively at Kirk's comfortable clothing. Some people are content to merely exist, never reaching for something greater. The irony of his words hung in the air like expensive cologne, obvious to everyone except the man who had spoken them. As the flight continued its journey across America, the stage was set for a revelation that would transform this first-class cabin into a theater of the absurd, where lessons about true success and genuine character were about to be taught in the most unexpected way. For hours into the flight from New York to Los Angeles, fate decided to play its hand. The moment came not with a dramatic announcement or a grand gesture, but with the innocent curiosity of Margaret Thompson, who could no longer contain herself after witnessing Robert Sterling's relentless display of arrogance. "Excuse me," she called from her seat, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom, "but I simply must ask, aren't you Kirk Douglas? I saw Spartacus when it first premiered, and I've followed your career ever since." Robert Sterling, who had been midway through another story about his tech innovations, froze with his champagne glass halfway to his lips. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the gentle hum of the aircraft engines. Catherine Martinez, who had been waiting for this moment since takeoff, couldn't quite suppress her smile as she watched the color drain from Robert's face. The tech executive's expression underwent a remarkable transformation, like a computer screen suddenly experiencing a system crash. "Kirk Douglas?" Robert stammered, his eyes darting between his elderly seatmate and Margaret Thompson. The blood seemed to drain from his face in stages, like a building losing power floor by floor. His hands, which had been so confidently adjusting his expensive cufflinks all flight, began to tremble slightly. James Wilson, the retired film critic, leaned forward in his seat, savoring every moment of this revelation. He had covered Kirk Douglas's career for decades and knew the impact this man had had on Hollywood, not just as an actor, but as someone who had helped break the Hollywood blacklist at great personal risk. Sandra Parker watched as Robert's carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbled. The tech executive's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. His Patek Philippe watch caught the cabin light as his hands shook noticeably. Around the first-class cabin, the reaction was spreading like ripples in a pond. Emily Watson appeared with a professional smile, though her eyes danced with barely contained amusement. "Mr. Douglas," she said, "would you like anything? A fresh drink perhaps?" The deliberate use of his name seemed to drive the final nail into Robert's coffin of superiority. Kirk, however, maintained the same calm, friendly demeanor he'd displayed throughout the flight. "I'm fine, thanks," he replied before turning to Margaret Thompson with a warm smile. "And yes, you're right. Always nice to meet someone who remembers the classics." The contrast between Kirk's genuine warmth and Robert's earlier condescension couldn't have been more stark. Here was a man who had every right to lord his success over others, choosing instead to respond with grace and humility. David Foster appeared with fresh towels, seemingly out of nowhere, as other passengers began sharing their favorite Kirk Douglas films. The genuine enthusiasm and respect in these interactions stood in sharp relief against Robert's hours of pretension. Captain Thomas Brooks, making another pass through the cabin, paused to shake Kirk's hand. "Mr. Douglas, it's an honor to have you aboard. My father was a huge fan of Champion and Ace in the Hole. He made sure I grew up watching the classics." Robert, meanwhile, had become intensely interested in the view outside his window, though his reflection in the plexiglass betrayed a face flushed with embarrassment. His earlier boasts about billion-dollar deals seemed particularly hollow now, considering he had spent hours lecturing an actor whose impact on American culture was immeasurable. "You know," Kirk said casually, his voice carrying that familiar powerful resonance, "I started out in poverty, the son of immigrant ragpickers. My first job in New York was as a waiter, long before pictures." His tone was conversational, carrying no hint of retaliation or spite. "Success isn't about what you own or how important you think you are, it's about what you contribute to others." Catherine Martinez had to turn away to hide her smile as Robert seemed to physically deflate in his expensive Armani suit. The man who had been so eager to dispense career advice was now faced with the fact that he had attempted to mentor one of Hollywood's greatest legends. The other passengers in first class were making no effort to hide their interest now. Sandra Parker had given up any pretense of working on her laptop, while Michael Collins had abandoned his attempts to disappear into his seat. This was the kind of moment that would be retold countless times, a perfect parable about the dangers of assumption and arrogance. I had no idea," Robert finally managed to stammer, his voice having lost all its earlier pomposity. "I mean, I didn't recognize. I should have." He trailed off, seemingly realizing that each word was only making things worse. Kirk's response was characteristic of the man known in Hollywood for his strength of character. "No worries, son," he said easily. "You weren't wrong about one thing. Presentation can be important. But sometimes, comfort matters more than appearance, especially at my age." He smiled, and there wasn't a trace of mockery in it. Michael Collins seized this moment to lean forward. "Mr. Douglas," he said, his voice carrying an eagerness that contrasted sharply with his earlier attempt to distance himself from Robert, "my grandfather showed me Paths of Glory when I was young. It changed how I thought about war and leadership." The mention of Stanley Kubrick's anti-war masterpiece seemed to physically pain Robert, whose earlier dismissal of pictures hung in the air like an abandoned script. The man who had bragged about his tech innovations was now sitting next to someone who had helped shape American cinema and culture. James Wilson, who had remained silent throughout much of the flight, finally spoke up. "You know, Mr. Douglas, your decision to credit Dalton Trumbo for Spartacus helped break the Hollywood blacklist. That took real courage, the kind that has nothing to do with money or status." Kirk engaged warmly with these comments, discussing his various roles and career decisions with the same unpretentious enthusiasm he'd shown throughout his career. He spoke about the importance of standing up for what's right, about using success to help others, and about maintaining humility, all while Robert seemed to be attempting to physically shrink into his expensive suit. Margaret Thompson, who had sparked this revelation, shared her memories of seeing Kirk's films in theaters when they were first released. Her genuine appreciation served to emphasize how false Robert's earlier condescension had been. "The thing about success," Kirk said thoughtfully, though he wasn't specifically addressing Robert, "is that it comes with responsibility. Power isn't about what you can demand from others, it's about what you can contribute to make things better for everyone." The irony of this statement, given Robert's earlier behavior, was lost on no one. Catherine Martinez was watching with undisguised admiration now, recognizing that she had witnessed something far more valuable than a simple celebrity encounter. This was a masterclass in handling difficult situations with grace and dignity. Emily Watson approached one final time, her professional demeanor slightly softened by respect. "Mr. Douglas," she said, "the chef wanted to know if you'd like to try his special dessert preparation. He's quite a fan of your work." The contrast between this genuine respect and Robert's manufactured importance was striking. Kirk accepted the offer with genuine appreciation, while Robert seemed to be reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. As the flight continued over America's heartland, the atmosphere in first class had transformed. The man in the expensive suit had been revealed as a paper tiger, while the casually dressed elderly passenger he had dismissed had proven to be not just a star, but a legend who had helped shape American culture. The story of what happened next would be shared in corporate boardrooms and Hollywood gatherings alike, a reminder that true class has nothing to do with the price of one's suit or the face of one's watch. It has everything to do with how you treat others, especially when you think they have nothing to offer you. As Flight 223 began its descent into Los Angeles, the first-class cabin had become a stage for a different kind of performance, one of grace, humility, and wisdom. The remaining hours of the flight had transformed what began as a tale of arrogance into a powerful lesson about judgment and genuine character. Robert Sterling, the man who had spent hours broadcasting his importance, now sat in uncomfortable silence, his Armani suit feeling more like a costume than a symbol of status. The magnitude of his misjudgment seemed to weigh on him with each passing minute, his earlier bravado replaced by a palpable sense of regret. Kirk Douglas, however, showed no sign of satisfaction at Robert's discomfort. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone in the cabin. He engaged Robert in genuine conversation. Not about status or success, but about the real challenges of making a difference in the world. "You know," Kirk said, his voice carrying that powerful resonance that had commanded attention for decades, "I've learned that everyone has a story worth hearing. Sometimes the most valuable connections come from the most unexpected places." The words weren't delivered as a rebuke, but as a gentle invitation to dialogue. Catherine Martinez, making her final rounds through the cabin, witnessed something remarkable. Robert, his defensive armor finally cracked, began to speak not as the self-important tech executive, but as a human being. He spoke of the pressure to maintain an image, the constant need to prove himself, the exhausting performance of perpetual superiority. James Wilson, still watching from across the aisle, saw the moment for what it was, not a victory of celebrity over arrogance, but a reminder that genuine connection happens when we drop our pretenses and speak truth to one another. "I've been in tech for 15 years, Robert admitted, his voice having lost its earlier pompous tone, "and somewhere along the way, I started believing that worth was measured by the size of your deals or the price of your accessories." He paused, looking down at his Patek Philippe watch as if seeing it for the first time. "I forgot what it meant to simply be human." Sandra Parker, who had witnessed the entire transformation, realized she was watching not just an ending, but a beginning. This wasn't a story about humiliation or comeuppance. It was about transformation and the possibility of change, even at 35,000 feet. Kirk shared stories from his own journey, the poverty of his childhood, the struggles of his early career, the moments when he had to choose between what was easy and what was right. He spoke about breaking the Hollywood blacklist, about the courage it takes to stand up for others when it might cost you everything. Emily Watson, bringing the final round of refreshments before landing, heard Kirk talking about his autobiography, The Ragman's Son. The actor's eyes lit up as he described his parents' immigrant journey, their struggles, and how it shaped his understanding of true worth. "That's why I wore these clothes today," Kirk explained, gesturing to his comfortable cardigan. "At my age, you learn that comfort and dignity have nothing to do with labels. They come from knowing who you are and standing up for what you believe in." Robert listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in years. The other passengers watched as his face softened, the mask of superiority giving way to something more authentic. "I think," he said slowly, "I've been measuring success by the wrong metrics." David Foster, who had witnessed the entire transformation, spoke up. Sometimes, he offered, our greatest achievements have nothing to do with what we own or how important we seem to others. Sometimes they're about the moments when we choose to be kind, to be real. Michael Collins, who had spent most of the flight trying to distance himself from Robert's behavior, now engaged in the conversation. He spoke about growing up watching Kirk's films with his grandfather, about how stories could change people's perspectives and touch their hearts. Margaret Thompson approached with her copy of Kirk's autobiography, which she happened to have in her carry-on bag. Kirk signed it with genuine warmth, taking time to hear her memories of seeing his films in theaters when they first released. Captain Thomas Brooks, making his final pass through the cabin before landing, paused to observe the scene. In his years of flying, he had seen countless displays of status and importance, but rarely had he witnessed such a genuine transformation. "You want to know the real secret of lasting impact?" Kirk asked, his voice carrying that warm authority that had captivated audiences for decades. "It's not about the money you make or the power you wield. It's about the lives you touch and the principles you stand for." Robert nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I've spent years trying to prove I belonged among the elite," he admitted, "when I should have been focusing on using my success to make a real difference." As the Los Angeles skyline appeared through the windows, Kirk shared one final thought. "In my career, I've played characters who discover their true strength isn't in their power or position, but in their humanity. Sometimes life has a way of teaching us the same lesson." The plane descended through layers of clouds, the cabin falling quiet as each passenger reflected on what they had witnessed. This wasn't just a story about a celebrity encounter, it was a reminder that every interaction carries the potential for growth, for connection, for transformation. Catherine Martinez began preparing the cabin for landing, but not before hearing Robert say something that surprised everyone. "Mr. Douglas," he said, his voice humble but sincere, "thank you. Not for who you are, but for showing me who I could be." Kirk's response was characteristic of the man who had fought battles both on screen and off. "Thank you for reminding me that everyone deserves a chance to show their better self. Sometimes we just need the right moment to let it shine through." As the aircraft touched down at LAX, the story of what happened on that flight was already spreading through messages and calls. But the real story wasn't about a Hollywood legend and a humbled tech executive. It was about the possibility of change, the power of genuine connection, and the truth that real legacy isn't something you wear, it's something you demonstrate through your actions. Sandra Parker, gathering her belongings, realized she had witnessed something far more valuable than a simple incident of comeuppance. She had seen a masterclass in handling conflict with grace, in transforming confrontation into connection, in choosing wisdom over revenge. The seatbelt sign chimed its final alert as the plane taxied to the gate. In the golden California sunshine, Robert Sterling straightened his tie one last time, not as a symbol of status, but as a reminder of a lesson learned at 35,000 feet. Kirk gathered his worn paperback and stood, offering a genuine smile to everyone around him. "Safe travels, everyone," he said, his words carrying the same warmth whether addressed to flight crew or first-class passengers. "Remember, every journey has the potential to teach us something about ourselves." As the passengers began to disembark, the story of what happened on that flight was already becoming the kind of tale that would be shared in boardrooms and coffee shops alike. A reminder that true worth isn't about what you own or how important you seem, but about how you treat others when you think no one of consequence is watching. Let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced a moment that changed your perspective on success and status. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, and every day brings new opportunities to choose humility over arrogance, understanding over assumption, and genuine connection over superficial status. Remember to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that the most important transformations often happen when we least expect them, and that true legacy isn't something you showcase, it's something you live.